The morning sun cast long shadows across the Cincinnati airport terminal as J.D. Vance checked his watch for the third time in 5 minutes. His flight to Washington, D.C. was scheduled to depart in 45 minutes, and he needed to be there for an important Senate committee meeting. The vice president had a packed schedule, but today felt different somehow. Sarah, his chief of staff, walked beside him carrying a thick folder of briefing materials. "The meeting with the Agriculture Committee starts at 2, she reminded him, scrolling through her tablet. Senator Williams wants to discuss the new farm bill before the full session. Vance nodded, his mind already focused on the challenges ahead. The past few months in office had been a whirlwind of policy decisions and public appearances. Every day brought new responsibilities, new people to meet, and new problems to solve. Sometimes he missed the simpler days when he was just an author and venture capitalist in Ohio. They approached the airline counter where a small crowd had gathered. Vance noticed several passengers looking frustrated, their voices raised in animated conversation with the airline staff. Something was clearly wrong. "Excuse me?" Sarah stepped forward to the counter agent, a young woman named Michelle whose name tag gleamed under the fluorescent lights. "We have tickets for Flight 447 to Washington, D.C. Michelle looked up from her computer screen, her expression strained. She glanced at Vance, recognition flickering in her eyes, then back to her screen. "I'm sorry, but we're having some issues with that flight today." "What kind of issues?" Vance asked, stepping closer to the counter. He kept his voice calm and friendly, the way he had learned to do during countless public interactions. "Well, sir," Michelle hesitated, her fingers drumming nervously on the keyboard. "There's been a situation. We've had to make some difficult decisions about passenger accommodations today." Other travelers in line began to murmur among themselves. A businessman in a wrinkled suit tapped his foot impatiently. A mother with 2 small children looked worried about missing their connection. An elderly couple sat on nearby chairs, looking confused and tired. Sarah sensed something unusual in the agent's tone. "What exactly does that mean?" "We have confirmed first-class tickets." Michelle's supervisor, a stern-looking man in his 50s named Robert, appeared behind the counter. He whispered something in Michelle's ear, and her face grew even more uncomfortable. "Mr. Vance," Robert said, his voice carefully measured, "I'm afraid we cannot accommodate you on today's flight." The words hung in the air like a challenge. Vance felt a flash of surprise but kept his expression neutral. "I'm sorry, could you explain why? Is the flight overbooked?" "Not exactly overbooked, sir. We've received concerns about your presence on the aircraft today." Sarah's eyes widened. "Concerns? What kind of concerns?" Robert cleared his throat, clearly uncomfortable with the conversation. "Some passengers have expressed strong feelings about traveling with you, sir. For safety and comfort reasons, we've decided it would be best if you took a different flight." The surrounding passengers had now stopped their own conversations and were openly listening. Several people had their phones out, though whether they were recording or just checking social media was unclear. Vance took a deep breath, processing what he was hearing. As vice president, he was used to strong reactions from people who disagreed with his political views. But being denied boarding on a commercial flight was something entirely new. "I see," he said quietly. "And which passengers exactly have raised these concerns?" Michelle glanced nervously at her supervisor, then back at her computer screen. "We can't reveal specific passenger information, sir. It's company policy." "Of course," Vance nodded. "But surely you understand that this puts us in a difficult position. I have official government business in Washington today." A woman standing 3 people back in line suddenly spoke up. "Good for you, Airline," she called out. "Some people shouldn't be allowed to fly with decent folks." Her comment sparked immediate reactions from other passengers. A man near the window shook his head in disgust. "This is America, lady. Everyone has the right to travel." "Not when they're destroying our country," the woman shot back. Sarah stepped, protectively closer to Vance, but he remained calm. He had dealt with hostile crowds before, during campaign events and public appearances. The key was never to escalate the situation. Robert raised his hands, trying to restore order. Please, everyone, let's keep this civil. This is a private business decision based on passenger safety and comfort. Whose safety? Asked the businessman, in the wrinkled suit. The guy's the Vice President of the United States. He's got more security clearance than anyone here. Vance appreciated the support, but he could see the situation was spiraling beyond what anyone had expected. The last thing he wanted was to create a scene that would end up on the evening news and make things harder for everyone involved. Look, he said, addressing Robert directly, I understand you're trying to do your job, but I hope you also understand the precedent this sets. Today it's me, tomorrow it could be any passenger whose political views someone objects to. Robert's expression suggested he hadn't considered the broader implications. Airlines were private companies, but they also operated under federal regulations and served the general public. We're just trying to avoid any incidents, sir, he said weakly. What kind of incidents are you expecting? Sarah asked pointedly. The vice president traveling to do his job? Meanwhile, more passengers continued to arrive at the gate area. Some recognized Vance and began taking pictures. Others seemed oblivious to the drama unfolding at the counter. A flight attendant named Jennifer approached the group, having heard about the situation from other crew members. She looked troubled. Is there really a safety concern? She asked Robert quietly. We're being cautious, Robert replied, but his voice lacked conviction. Vance watched the airline employees struggle with their decision. He could see they were caught between company policies, passenger complaints, and the unprecedented nature of the situation. None of them had probably dealt with anything like this before. The question now was what he would do next. He could demand to speak with higher management, potentially creating a bigger scene. He could accept the decision and look for alternative transportation, which might make him look weak. Or he could find a third option that no one was expecting. As he considered his choices, Vance noticed something that gave him an idea. It was something that would turn this entire situation into an opportunity rather than a setback. What Vance had noticed was a group of young military personnel in uniform sitting near the departure gate. They were clearly traveling together, probably heading back to their base after leave or training. Their conversation had stopped when the commotion began, and they were watching the situation with interest. But it wasn't just the soldiers that caught his attention. Throughout the terminal, he could see ordinary Americans going about their daily lives. A janitor quietly mopping. The floor nearby had paused his work to listen. An airport security guard stood at a respectful distance, ready to intervene if needed, but hoping he wouldn't have to. A coffee shop worker had stepped out from behind her counter, drawn by the unusual scene. These were the people Vance had entered, politics to serve. Not the wealthy donors or political insiders in Washington, but regular working Americans who deserved better from their leaders and their institutions. You know what? Vance said, turning back to Robert. I think you might be right about one thing. Maybe this flight isn't the best place for me today. Sarah looked at him in surprise. This wasn't the response she had expected. Robert seemed relieved, thinking the problem was solved. However, Vance continued, I'd like to understand something first. You mentioned passenger concerns about my presence. I'm curious about the other side of that equation. What do you mean? Michelle asked. Vance gestured toward the growing crowd of onlookers. Have any passengers expressed that they'd be comfortable traveling with me? Or perhaps even pleased to have their vice president on their flight? Robert frowned. This wasn't a question he had prepared for. Well, we haven't really asked. Might I suggest you do? Vance said with a slight smile. In the interest of fairness, of course. You've heard from passengers who object to my presence. Perhaps you should also hear from those who don't. Sarah began to understand where this was going. Her boss wasn't backing down. He was changing the game entirely. Jennifer, the flight attendant, looked intrigued. That actually makes sense, she said to Robert. If we're making decisions based on passenger feedback, shouldn't we get feedback from all the passengers? I suppose, Robert said hesitantly. Great, Vance said. Sarah, would you mind helping me with something? He pulled out his phone and opened the voice recording app. I'd like to document this process for transparency. Within minutes, word had spread throughout the gate area that the airline was conducting an informal survey of passenger opinions. The response was immediate and overwhelming. The group of military personnel approached first. A young sergeant named Rodriguez spoke for his unit. Sir, it would be an honor to fly with the Vice President. We took an oath to support and defend the Constitution, and that includes the people elected under it, regardless of party. His fellow soldiers nodded in agreement. One of them, a corporal named Johnson, added, My family doesn't always agree with politicians, but we respect the office and the democratic process. The businessman in the wrinkled suit came forward next. I run a small manufacturing company in Ohio, he said. I may not have voted for your ticket, but you're my vice president too. This whole situation is ridiculous. More passengers began to speak up. A retired teacher named Mrs. Patterson said she disagreed with many of Vance's policies, but thought denying him service was wrong. In my 40 years of teaching, I learned that you can disagree with someone's ideas while still treating them with basic respect. A young college student studying political science was excited about the possibility of meeting a sitting vice president. This could be a once-in-a-lifetime opportunity, she told the airline staff. I'm writing my thesis on American political institutions. Even some passengers who clearly weren't supporters expressed discomfort with the airline's decision. A union organizer from Detroit said, Look, I'm no fan of his politics, but this sets a bad precedent. What happens when airlines start picking and choosing passengers based on political views? Robert found himself in an increasingly uncomfortable position. The vocal opposition that had prompted the original decision was being drowned out by passengers who either supported Vance's right to travel or were opposed to the airline's discrimination. Jennifer quietly counted the responses. So far, we have about 30 passengers saying they're fine with the vice president traveling and only 3 who have objected, she reported to Robert. And, Sarah added, reviewing her notes, of those 3 objections, 2 were based on general political disagreement, not any specific safety concerns. The 3rd objection had come from the woman who had shouted earlier. When asked to explain her safety concerns, she had been unable to articulate any specific threat beyond her general anger about political issues. Vance watched this process unfold with growing interest. What had started as a potential embarrassment was becoming something much more valuable, a real-time demonstration of how ordinary Americans could come together despite political differences. The janitor who had been mopping nearby approached the group. His name tag read Carlos, and he spoke with a slight accent. "Excuse me," he said politely. "I don't mean to interrupt, but I wanted to say something." Robert looked surprised that an airport employee was joining the conversation, but Vance encouraged Carlos to continue. "I came to this country 15 years ago," Carlos said. "I worked 2 jobs to support my family. I don't always understand politics, but I understand respect. This man was elected by the American people. Whether you voted for him or not, he deserves basic respect." Carlos's words seemed to resonate with many of the passengers. Several people nodded in agreement, and a few applauded quietly. "Furthermore," Carlos continued, "if airlines can refuse service to elected officials because some passengers complain, what's next? Will they refuse service to police officers, firefighters, teachers? Where does it end?" His question hung in the air, highlighting the broader implications of the airline's decision. The airport security guard, who had been watching the situation carefully, approached Robert. "Sir, I need to point out that we have no security concerns about the vice president traveling. His security detail coordinates with us regularly, and there are no unusual threats or risks today. This was perhaps the most damaging revelation for the airline's position. If their decision wasn't based on genuine security concerns, and if the majority of passengers had no objection to Vance's presence, then what exactly was their justification? Robert looked around at the crowd that had gathered. News of the situation was spreading through social media, and he could see more people arriving to watch what was unfolding. This was no longer a simple customer service issue. It was becoming a public relations nightmare. But Vance wasn't finished yet. He had one more move that would transform this entire situation from a problem into an opportunity that everyone would remember. Vance looked around at the crowd that had gathered and made a decision that would surprise everyone. Instead of pressing his advantage or demanding to be seated on the flight, he did something completely unexpected. "You know what?" he announced to the group. "I think there's a better solution here, one that might actually help everyone." Sarah raised an eyebrow. She had worked with Vance long enough to know that tone of voice usually meant he was about to do something that would make her job more interesting. "What if," Vance continued, "instead of fighting about who gets to fly where, we use this as an opportunity to actually talk to each other?" Robert looked confused. "I'm not sure I follow, sir." Vance gestured toward the departure area. "This flight isn't leaving for another hour, right? And we have all these people here from different backgrounds, different political views, different life experiences. When's the last time any of us had a real conversation with someone who sees the world differently?" The college student studying political science perked up immediately. "Are you suggesting some kind of public dialogue?" "Exactly," Vance said. "Not a debate or an argument, but an actual conversation. We can use that empty gate area over there. Anyone who wants to participate can join in. Anyone who doesn't can just wait for their flight normally." Carlos, the janitor, looked intrigued. "You mean like regular people talking to the vice president?" "Regular. People talking to each other," Vance corrected. "I may hold an office, but I'm also just another American citizen trying to figure out how we can work together better." The retired teacher, Mrs. Patterson, smiled. "In my classroom, I used to call these circle discussions. Everyone gets to speak, everyone gets to listen, and we all learn something." Jennifer, the flight attendant, was fascinated by the idea. "I meet hundreds of people every week, but we never really talk about anything meaningful. It's always just coffee or tea, and please fasten your seatbelts." Robert, meanwhile, was clearly out of his depth. This wasn't covered in any airline training manual. "I'm not sure company policy allows for delayed flights due to weather, mechanical issues, and passenger safety," Vance pointed out gently. "This is a passenger comfort issue, right? Well, maybe the most comfortable thing for everyone would be to clear the air through honest conversation." The union organizer from Detroit scratched his chin thoughtfully. "You know, this is kind of crazy, but it might actually work. I spend all day talking to workers who feel like politicians don't listen to them. And I spend all day in meetings with politicians who feel like regular people don't understand the complexities of governing," Vance replied. "Maybe we're both right, and maybe that's exactly the problem." Sarah was frantically calculating the schedule implications in her head. "Sir, the committee meeting can wait," Vance said firmly. "Or we can attend by video conference. This is more important." More passengers began to express interest in the unusual proposal. The military personnel were particularly enthusiastic. Sergeant Rodriguez explained, "We serve all Americans, regardless of their politics. It would be valuable to hear different perspectives on what people expect from their government." An older man wearing a veteran's cap introduced himself as Tom, a retired factory worker. "I've got opinions about a lot of things, but I don't often get to share them with someone who might actually be able to do something about them." A young mother with 2 children wasn't sure about participating but was curious to watch. "My kids have never seen anything like this," she said. "It might be educational." The woman who had initially objected to Vance's presence remained skeptical. This just seems like a publicity stunt, she said loudly. Vance nodded respectfully. You might be right. And if you think that, you're absolutely welcome to say so. That's part of the conversation, too. I'd actually be interested to hear why you feel that way. His response seemed to surprise her. She had expected an argument or dismissal, not genuine interest in her perspective. Carlos asked a practical question. Where exactly would we do this? And who would be in charge? No one would be in charge, Vance said. That's the point. As for where, let's ask the airport if we can use that empty gate area. The airline is already dealing with an unusual situation. Maybe they'd be willing to help us try an unusual solution. Jennifer volunteered to speak with airport management. I know the terminal supervisor. Let me see what we can work out. While Jennifer went to make arrangements, more travelers began to gather around the discussion. Word was spreading through social media, and people from other parts of the airport were coming to see what was happening. A food service worker named Maria joined the group. I've been working here for 8 years, she said, and I've never seen anything like this. Usually when there's a problem, people just get angry and storm off. Maybe that's part of the problem, suggested the college student. We've forgotten how to solve disagreements through conversation instead of conflict. Robert was still trying to figure out his role in all this. The situation had evolved far beyond standard airline procedures. His supervisor would probably want a detailed report, but what exactly would he say? Vice President denied boarding, so he organized impromptu civics lesson. The security guard approached Robert quietly. Sir, we've been monitoring the situation, and there are no safety concerns. Actually, this seems to be calming things down rather than stirring them up. That was true. The initial tension and anger in the air had been replaced by curiosity and genuine interest. People who had been frustrated about flight delays or other travel issues were now engaged in something much more meaningful. Jennifer returned with good news. The airport is willing to let us use Gate 12. It's not being used for the next 2 hours, and it has a good seating arrangement for group discussions. Tom, the retired factory worker, laughed. Well, I'll be damned. I came here to catch a flight to visit my grandkids, and I'm about to have a political discussion with the Vice President of the United States. Not a political discussion, Vance clarified. A human discussion about how we can understand each other better and work together more effectively. As the group began moving toward Gate 12, more passengers and airport employees joined them. What had started as a customer service problem was becoming something unprecedented, a spontaneous forum for American democracy in action. But the most surprising development was yet to come, when someone unexpected would join the conversation and change everything once again. As the group settled into the chairs at Gate 12, an unexpected figure approached from across the terminal. It was Senator Elizabeth Warren, who had been traveling through Cincinnati on her way to a climate change conference in Chicago. She had heard about the unusual situation through her own staff, who had seen the social media posts. Mind if I join this conversation? Warren asked, her presence immediately adding a new dynamic to the gathering. The crowd stirred with surprise. Here were two politicians from very different backgrounds and political philosophies coming together in an airport terminal for an impromptu public dialogue. Vance stood up and extended his hand. Senator Warren, what a pleasant surprise. Please join us. Warren shook his hand and looked around at the diverse group that had assembled. I have to say, this is not what I expected to find at the airport today. But maybe it's exactly what the country needs. The college student was practically vibrating with excitement. This is incredible. I'm getting to witness bipartisan dialogue in real time. Tom, the retired factory worker, was more skeptical. Well, this should be interesting. We've got politicians from both sides now. Let's see if they actually talk to us or just use us as props for their next campaign ads. Warren laughed. That's a fair concern, Tom, and honestly, the only way to prove we're not doing that is through our actions here today. Vance nodded in agreement. Tom raises an important point. Politicians talk about regular Americans all the time, but how often do we actually listen to regular Americans? And when we do, are we really hearing what you're saying or just waiting for our turn to talk? Carlos, the janitor, raised his hand tentatively. Can I ask something? You two probably disagree about a lot of things, right? Quite a lot, Warren confirmed with a smile. So how do you work together when you have to? I mean, you're both in the government. It was a simple question, but it cut right to the heart of what many Americans wanted to understand about politics. Vance thought for a moment. That's actually a great question, Carlos. Senator Warren and I do disagree on many policy issues, but we both care about making life better for Americans. Sometimes we just have different ideas about how to do that. For example, Warren added, we might disagree about the best way to help working families, but we both want working families to succeed. So sometimes we can find common ground on specific programs or policies, even if our overall approaches are different. Maria, the food service worker, looked curious. But what about when you can't find common ground? What happens then? Then, we disagree respectfully, Warren said. Or at least that's how it should work. We present our cases, we vote, and we accept the results. Then we move on to the next issue and try again. Sergeant Rodriguez from the military group spoke up. In the Army, we have people from all different backgrounds and beliefs, but we work together because we have a shared mission. Do you think politicians have lost sight of their shared mission? That question created a moment of thoughtful silence. It was exactly the kind of insight that could only come from someone with real-world experience, working in diverse teams under pressure. I think that's exactly right, Vance said slowly. Our shared mission should be serving the American people, but sometimes we get so focused on our different methods that we forget about our common goal. Warren nodded. And frankly, the way media coverage works doesn't help. Cooperation doesn't make headlines the way conflict does. So the public sees more of our disagreements than our areas of agreement. Mrs. Patterson, the retired teacher, leaned forward. In my classroom, when students were fighting, I used to make them find one thing they agreed on before they could continue arguing. Do you think that would work in politics? We actually do that sometimes, Warren said. There are bipartisan caucuses where senators from both parties work together on specific issues, but you're right that it doesn't get much attention. The union organizer from Detroit had been listening carefully. Here's what I don't understand, he said. Workers in my union disagree about lots of things. Social issues, foreign policy, you name it. But when it comes to workplace safety or fair wages, we stick together because those issues directly affect our lives. Why can't politicians do the same thing on issues that affect all Americans? Vance and Warren exchanged a look. It was another penetrating question that got to fundamental problems in the political system. Part of the challenge, Vance explained, is that we represent different constituencies with different priorities. What helps workers in Detroit might hurt farmers in Ohio, or vice versa. But that's exactly when you need to work together, Tom interjected. Find solutions that help both groups, or at least don't hurt either one. You're absolutely right, Warren said, and we do try to do that. But it's harder than it sounds. Sometimes the trade-offs are genuinely difficult. Jennifer, the flight attendant, had been thinking about something. Can I ask about the original problem that brought us all together? The airline situation? Robert, who had been sitting quietly and looking increasingly uncomfortable, shifted in his seat. What I don't understand, Jennifer continued, is how we got to a point where businesses think they should be making decisions about who can travel based on politics. That seems dangerous for everyone. It is dangerous, Warren agreed. Whether you're a Republican or a Democrat, the idea that private companies can discriminate based on political views should concern everyone. Vance looked at Robert. I don't think anyone here wants to put the airline in an impossible position. But Jennifer raises an important point about the precedent this sets. Carlos spoke up again. In my country, before I came here, we had problems when businesses started choosing sides in politics. It made everything more difficult for regular people. His comment reminded everyone that the principles they were discussing weren't abstract political theories. They had real-world consequences for people's daily lives. The young mother with 2 children had been listening quietly, but now she spoke up. "I want my kids to grow up in a country where people can disagree without hating each other. Watching you all talk like this gives me hope." Her words seemed to resonate with everyone in the group. Even the woman who had initially objected to Vance's presence was listening intently, though she hadn't yet joined the conversation. The college student raised her hand. "I have a question for both of you. What would you tell young people who are discouraged about politics? A lot of my friends think the system is broken and their votes don't matter." It was a question that both politicians clearly took seriously, and their answers would reveal a lot about their fundamental beliefs about American democracy. But before they could respond, an announcement over the airport intercom would interrupt their conversation and create yet another unexpected twist in an already extraordinary day. The airport intercom crackled to life with an announcement that caught everyone's attention. "Ladies and gentlemen, due to severe weather moving through the Washington, D.C. area, all flights to Ronald Reagan National Airport and Dulles International Airport have been delayed indefinitely. We apologize for the inconvenience and will provide updates as conditions improve." A collective groan went up from travelers throughout the terminal, but at Gate 12 the mood was different. Warren laughed and looked around the group. "Well, it looks like we have more time for this conversation than we planned." Vance checked his phone, where Sarah was already sending him updates about the weather situation. "The committee meeting has been postponed anyway," he told the group, "so we might as well make good use of the time." The college student who had asked about young people and politics was still waiting for an answer. "You were about to tell us what you'd say to discouraged young voters." Warren leaned forward, her expression serious. "I'd tell them that their voices matter more than they know. Every major change in American history started with people who were told their efforts wouldn't make a difference. But I'd also tell them," Vance added, "that democracy isn't just about voting every few years. It's about staying engaged, having conversations like this one, and working to understand different perspectives." Tom, the retired factory worker, shook his head. "That sounds nice. But what about when politicians make promises during campaigns and then do something completely different once they're in office?" It was a pointed question that both senators had undoubtedly heard many times before. "That's a fair criticism," Warren acknowledged. "Sometimes circumstances change, or we learn new information that changes our approach. But you're right that politicians need to do a better job of explaining those changes instead of just hoping people don't notice." "And," Vance said, "voters need to hold us accountable, not just at election time, but continuously. Call our offices, show up at town halls, write letters. Most politicians actually want to hear from constituents even when the feedback is critical." Carlos raised his hand again. "But what if you don't speak English perfectly, or you don't understand all the complicated political language? How can regular people participate?" "That's exactly the kind of barrier we should be working to eliminate," Warren said. "Government should be accessible to everyone, not just people with college degrees or political experience." Maria, the food service worker, nodded enthusiastically. "I work 2 jobs and have 3 kids. I care about politics, but I don't have time to research every issue or attend meetings during the day." "Which is why conversations like this matter," Vance said. "We need to meet people where they are, not expect everyone to come to us." Sergeant Rodriguez had been thinking about something. "In the military, we have a concept called mission command. Leaders set the overall goal, but people at different levels have the freedom to figure out how to achieve it. Do you think that could work in government?" Warren's eyes lit up. "That's actually a fascinating analogy. Instead of trying to micromanage every detail from Washington, what if we focused on setting clear goals and let communities figure out the best ways to achieve them?" "Local solutions to local problems," Vance agreed, "with federal support and coordination where needed." The union organizer leaned back in his chair. "You know, listening to you two talk. You actually agree on more things than I expected. Why don't we see this kind of cooperation more often? It was the question everyone had been thinking but hadn't quite articulated. Honestly? Warren said. Part of it is structural. The way campaigns are funded, the way media coverage works, the way congressional schedules are organized, all of it pushes toward conflict rather than collaboration. And part of it is human nature, Vance admitted. It's easier to rally people around opposition to something than support for something. Fear and anger are powerful motivators, even if they're not particularly productive. Mrs. Patterson, the retired teacher, nodded knowingly. I saw the same thing in schools. Parents would come together quickly to oppose something they didn't like, but it was much harder to get them engaged in supporting positive changes. Jennifer, the flight attendant, had been quiet for a while, but now she spoke up with conviction. I think what's happening here today is proof that regular people are smarter and more reasonable than politicians give them credit for. How so? Warren asked. Look around, Jennifer said, gesturing to the group. We have people from different backgrounds, different political views, different life experiences, but we're having a civil conversation about complex issues. No one's screaming, no one's walking away angry. We're actually listening to each other. Her observation sparked a moment of reflection. She was right. Despite their differences, the group had maintained a respectful and productive dialogue for over an hour. Maybe the problem isn't that Americans can't work together, Vance said slowly. Maybe the problem is that our institutions and systems make it harder for us to work together. The woman who had initially objected to Vance's presence finally spoke up. I have to admit this isn't what I expected, she said quietly. I came here angry about a lot of things, and I still disagree with many of your policies. But you've listened to what people have said without getting defensive or trying to argue with everyone. Vance turned to face her directly. What are you angry about? I'd genuinely like to understand. She hesitated for a moment, then began to speak about her concerns regarding economic inequality, healthcare costs, and feeling like her voice didn't matter in the political process. As she talked, it became clear that many of her frustrations were shared by others in the group, regardless of their political affiliations. Warren listened carefully and then said, You've raised issues that I work on every day in the Senate. We may disagree about solutions, but your concerns are completely valid. And some of your proposed solutions might actually work better than what we're doing now, Vance added. That's why we need more conversations like this. Tom looked around, the group with something approaching amazement. You know what? This has been the most useful political discussion I've ever had. And it's happening in an airport terminal? Carlos laughed. Maybe we should have all political meetings in airports. Everyone's already a little stressed, so they have to be extra polite. The humor helped lighten the mood. But there was also a serious underlying point. The informal setting had somehow made it easier for everyone to speak honestly and listen openly. As the conversation continued, it became clear that something significant was happening. This wasn't just a clever way to handle an airline dispute or a publicity opportunity for the politicians. It was a genuine demonstration of how American democracy could work when people approached each other with good faith and mutual respect. But the most important moment was yet to come. As their conversation continued, more people from throughout the airport had gathered around Gate 12. Airport employees on their breaks, travelers waiting for delayed flights, and even some crew, members from other airlines had joined the circle or were listening from nearby seats. What started as a group of about 20 people had grown to nearly 60. The discussion had evolved into something resembling a town hall meeting, but without the formal structure or political theater that usually accompanied such events. A young airport maintenance worker named David approached the group hesitantly. Excuse me, he said. I don't mean to interrupt, but I wanted to say something. Please, Warren encouraged him. What's on your mind? David looked nervous but determined. I've been working here for 3 years and I see hundreds of people every day. Rich people, poor people people from different countries, different backgrounds. But I hardly ever see them actually talking to each other about anything important. He paused, gathering his thoughts. Today, watching all of you, I realize something. We're not as different as we think we are. Everyone wants to feel heard, everyone wants to be treated fairly, and everyone wants their families to be safe and happy. His simple observation hit the group with surprising force. In an age of political polarization and social media echo chambers, the basic human similarities that David had identified were often forgotten. Maria, the food service worker, nodded vigorously. David's right. In my job, I serve people from all walks of life. The businessman in first class and the college student with a backpack both say please and thank you. They both worry about missing their connections. They're both just people, trying to get somewhere. Robert, the airline supervisor who had started this whole situation, had been listening to the conversation with growing discomfort. Not because of what was being said, but because of what it revealed about his earlier decision. I owe everyone here an apology, he said suddenly, his voice cutting through the murmur of conversation. What I did earlier, denying boarding based on political complaints, was wrong. Not just as a business decision, but as an American. The group turned to look at him with surprise. This was not the kind of admission anyone had expected. I was trying to avoid conflict, Robert continued, but instead, I was contributing to a bigger problem. I was treating political differences like they were more important than basic fairness and respect. Vance stood up and walked over to Robert. You know what? It takes courage to admit when you've made a mistake. And honestly, this whole situation turned out better than anyone could have planned. But that doesn't make what I did right, Robert insisted. No, it doesn't, Warren agreed. But what matters now is what we do going forward. What have you learned from today? Robert thought for a moment. I've learned that when you give people a chance to talk through their differences instead of just picking sides, most of them will choose understanding over conflict. The college student had been taking notes throughout the conversation. This is exactly what my professors talk about when they discuss deliberative democracy, she said excitedly. Citizens coming together to discuss issues in good faith, with the goal of understanding rather than winning. The difference is, Tom pointed out, this wasn't organized by professors or politicians. It just happened naturally when people were given the opportunity. Carlos raised an important question. So what happens now? Do we all just go back to our regular lives and pretend this never happened? It was a crucial moment. The conversation had been meaningful and productive, but would it have any lasting impact? Sergeant Rodriguez spoke up. In the military, when we have a successful operation, we always do an after-action review. We figure out what worked, what didn't work, and how we can apply those lessons in the future. That's a great idea, Jennifer said. What worked here that we could replicate in other situations? Mrs. Patterson, drawing on her teaching experience, offered some observations. People were willing to listen because no one was trying to change anyone else's mind. Everyone was just trying to understand different perspectives. And, added the union organizer, the politicians didn't act like politicians. They acted like people. No talking points, no campaign speeches, just honest conversation. Warren laughed. I'll take that as a compliment, even though it probably says something troubling about what people expect from politicians. Maria had a practical suggestion. What if airports had spaces for conversations like this? Not formal meetings, just comfortable areas where people could talk about important topics if they wanted to. Or community centers, suggested Carlos. Places where people from different backgrounds naturally come together anyway. David, the maintenance worker, was thinking bigger. What if this kind of thing happened regularly? Not just when there's a crisis or a problem, but as a normal part of how we do democracy? Vance was intrigued by the idea. Like citizens' assemblies or public forums, but less formal and more accessible. Exactly, David said. Make it as normal as going to the grocery store or the post office. The woman who had initially objected to Vance's presence looked thoughtful. I have to admit I came here today thinking politics was hopeless. But maybe the problem isn't politics itself. Maybe it's how we've been doing politics. Her transformation throughout the day had been remarkable. From angry opposition to thoughtful engagement, she embodied the possibility for change that the entire conversation represented. As the afternoon wore on, the airport announced that flights to Washington were beginning to resume. The weather had cleared, and normal operations would restart within the hour. "Well," Warren said, standing up and stretching, "I suppose this is where we return to reality." But Vance had one more idea. "Before we all scatter to catch our flights, what if we exchanged contact information? Not for political purposes, but to continue these conversations." Sarah, who had been documenting everything, looked concerned about the security implications, but Vance waved off her objections. "I'm not talking about personal phone numbers," he clarified, "but maybe we could set up a simple online forum where people from today's conversation could continue discussing issues, and maybe invite others to join." The response was immediately positive. People began sharing email addresses and social media information. The college student volunteered to help set up the online platform. Tom, the retired factory worker, summed up what many people were feeling. "You know, I've been voting for 50 years, and this is the first time I've ever felt like my voice actually mattered in a political conversation." As people began to gather their belongings and head back to their gates, the mood was noticeably different from earlier in the day. There was energy and optimism that hadn't been there before. Robert approached Vance one final time. "Sir, I want you to know that our airline will be reviewing our policies to make sure something like this morning never happens again." "I appreciate that," Vance replied. "But more importantly, I hope you'll consider how you can create more opportunities for positive interactions like we've had today." Jennifer, the flight attendant, had perhaps the best perspective on what had happened. "I've been flying for 15 years, she said, "and I've seen every kind of passenger conflict you can imagine, but I've never seen anything like this. People actually solved a problem by talking to each other instead of at each other." As the group dispersed, Carlos lingered for a moment with Warren and Vance. "Thank you for listening to someone like me," he said simply. "Thank you for reminding us why we got into public service in the first place," Warren replied. The last person to leave was David, the maintenance worker. "This won't be the last conversation like this, will it?" he asked hopefully. Vance smiled. "Not if we have anything to say about it." As Vance and Warren finally boarded their respective flights, both politicians were already thinking about how to recreate the magic of what had happened at Gate 12. Neither of them had planned to spend their day in an impromptu civics lesson, but both recognized that they had witnessed something important. The airline dispute that had threatened to become a public relations nightmare had instead become a demonstration of American democracy at its best. And it had all started because someone had been brave enough to suggest that talking to each other might work better than talking past each other. By the time the planes took off, social media was buzzing with reports of the airport town hall. Videos and photos from the conversation were being shared thousands of times, but more importantly, people were asking how they could organize similar discussions in their own communities. What had begun as a moment of division had become a catalyst for connection. And in a country that often seemed more focused on its differences than its common ground, that was exactly the kind of miracle that democracy needed.